Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another one of our Through the Bible studies, in which we'll not be going chapter and verse, but rather book by book through the Bible to give those of you listening at home a general idea of what these books of the Bibles include, not to provide an alternative, but rather to encourage further Bible study, and knowing where these themes, events, and illustrations ultimately would allude to in studying and comparing the Old and New Testaments. If you could turn with me to the book of 2 Samuel, I'd like to give you an overview and not only the historical context, but event by event, to give you an idea of the reign of King David. Now, for those of you who were with us in our previous study going through the first book of Samuel, David's had an interesting last 13 years in his life, and this was mostly because of the efforts of King Saul. There were also a good measure of his own mistakes, but that's what happens when you're writing a historical record. Samuel has passed from the world scene, so it would be kind of odd to say that Samuel wrote 2 Samuel since he was dead before the first was even finished. That's why there are multiple authors that are not only cited, but verified in writing this account. The prophet Nathan, and some of you may be familiar with him, he was the one who called David directly out when he had his affair with Bathsheba, which is mentioned and recorded in this account of what many would claim as just a fanciful record of Israel's greatest king and highly embellished for the sake of patriotism, only coming from the people who have never read it. And that's what I'd like to encourage you to do with me here and now. Understand once again, Nathan the prophet was the one who was leading the school of prophets, and therefore the one who was in charge of training most of the literate in Israel, the scribes, and those who would be not only citing down history, but also making the Word of God accessible to the nation as a whole. Obviously, no shortage of a task. He was very busy. But this was the kind of occupation that he was involved in. So therefore, this historical record in citing, and note as well why Samuel's name is assigned to this book, I think that's worth mentioning too. Samuel is recognized and credited to this book not because he was alive during the events that took place in this book, but because Samuel the prophet, the last judge, and with whom we read in the first and previous study, was a man who was used by God to anoint the first and the greatest kings of Israel. And those are two different individuals. Saul, of course, was anointed by Samuel, and so the account and reign of Saul was recorded and credited to him. And then likewise, he anointed King David to be his successor. However, he did not live to see that, and we're going to read why that was, because it actually still won't be some time before David ends up taking the throne. He was God's choice, but of course not the nation's, at least not yet, and David was going to wait for that to happen. He was not the kind of man who would stage a coup d'etat. That much of his character can be attested for, not because of embellishment, but because of history. Speaking of history, we are in 1000 BC, so that would be 3,000 years ago, at least from the time of this recording. Who knows, in the annals of human history, they may be listening to this millennia onward, unlikely, but still worth mentioning. 1000 BC, so that would be 3,000 years ago, and this takes place all in the nation of Israel, as it is known in modern days. Of course, why this book was written, to note not only the reign of Israel's greatest king, but also reminding us that that king was still human, and as a historical account includes his story, warts and all, and yet how God still used him. And likewise, how this was recorded, well, the same way that our history is recorded. If we reach the peak of our nation, why wouldn't we start writing things down? So, starting with the first event, we don't get into too many details yet about the reign of King David because he's still not on the throne. In fact, as you recall, the battle that ended the book of 1 Samuel resulted in the majority of Saul's family all getting killed. They were engaged in a battle with the Philistines. Saul's body was cut in pieces by the Philistines and sent to their various shrines just to mock the Israelites and saying, "Here's your champion," and so forth. And the individuals that he saved from the Syrian king named Nahash volunteered to retrieve those body parts, put them in what was called a sarcophagus, a life eater, and not in the Egyptian sense of the way. It would be this limestone box that would essentially cause the decaying process to occur faster, so that they can then gather his bones and put them in a bone box where he would be properly buried and given respects. Now, obviously, because his pieces were everywhere, they couldn't whole bury him, so they cremated him. And that was essentially how they would put this body. And once again, traditional as opposed to regular, it was the exception, not the rule. And that actually brings up sometimes an area of contention for some people. Is it wrong for Christians to be cremated? Shouldn't we be whole buried like Jesus? Well, for all intents and purposes, understand whether you're cremated, put in a sarcophagus or life eater, or just put inside the ground, you're going to end up in the same state. God's going to know how to put the pieces back together again. So it's not really an issue you should stress yourself about. I'd say the best thing to do is to just respect the individual's wishes, and whatever is going to be financially able for you to do in supporting your loved one, that is the direction you should take. But back to 2 Samuel. Saul and most, and I emphasize that most, of his family have died in battle with the Philistines. So now power has passed to the commander of his armies, who conveniently enough had decided to sit this battle out. His name, of course, was Abner. He was the one who was sleeping next to Saul when he had his entire army encamp around him, and God calls the whole camp to just go in comatose state, basically, so David could sneak in, grab Saul's spear, not run him through with it, and his water jug, and show that he wasn't his enemy for the second time. And so, essentially, power passed Abner. However, this would not be looked at well from those who followed the traditional, the son of the king inherits the crown. So they would look to Saul's last surviving biological son, whose name was Ishbosheth. Ishbosheth, that's an interesting name to remember, and definitely not one we'd want to try to recite 3 times fast. But this man Ishbosheth, which I guess we have already done by now, you can see I'm biting over my tongue here trying to pronounce it, but basically is now the king of Israel. And he's the public figurehead, but Abner's actually the one controlling the power, because Ishbosheth doesn't really have much substance to him as a man. Now, this is where things also get interesting, because while Ishbosheth is ruling the majority of Israel, the tribe of Judah understands, and the majority of them have come to terms with this, that Samuel didn't just anoint David as the next king, but it's pretty clear that God's called him to be that next successor. So they're supporting him as the next king of Israel, and are giving him the opportunity to live in safe harbor in Judah now that his crazy father-in-law isn't trying to mangle him anymore. And this is where things get interesting, because if you remember, one of the things that disqualified Saul from being king of Israel was when God told him to dispose of the Amalekites, that the people who essentially had founded their nation on terrorism, that attacked Israel when they were wandering through the wilderness, weren't a threat to anybody, and they went after the weak, the old, and the infirm. That was something that God said, basically the stopwatch has started for you people. If you guys don't get your act together, 400 years go by, just like with the Canaanites, just like the Israelites, you will be basically judged for your sin. So after ignoring all of these second chances, God ordered Saul to exterminate them down to the last man. And unfortunately, he did not obey that order. And in no shortage of irony, one of those survivors was looting the bodies and came across Saul's. Of course, he found his fancy armor, which no doubt would separate the king from the common soldier. Probably had his ceremonial gold band, a crown substitute, not the big fancy one that'd be rather impractical to carry into battle, but something that would set him apart from the soldiers. And he had a thought in his mind. He said, well, I could pawn this for the gold, or from what I've seen in Israel's politics, David's the next rising star. So maybe if I tell him that I killed his enemy, then I'll be living good. I'll be like one of his generals or something. I could either pay for the next 40 meals, or I could pay for the next 40 years of my life. So he decides to bring the gold band to David and say, hey, David, I found Saul on the battlefield with the Philistines, and he wasn't dead yet. And so what happened was he asked me to kill him, so I did. And I killed your greatest enemy. Reward, please. Now, of course, we know that this is ridiculous because we already have the historical account from the actual eyewitness sources that Saul had already committed suicide before the battle had ended. The Amalekite didn't assist in the process. Saul committed suicide on his own by falling on his own sword. Now, when the Amalekite then makes this alternative claim, immediately in the chapter following this account, because Samuel would have been one book, we divide it up because of the reigns of David and Saul, we keep them categorized this way. But understand this, we know that this guy's lying. And so the Amalekites expecting to get rewarded by David, but what does David do? He says, you murdered the king of Israel. No, David he still doesn't even know that he wasn't the king of Israel anymore. And he was disobeying God by holding on to that position, but still says, that's my father-in-law. That's my king. And because I honor God, I'm not going to dishonor his life. You took it. You're going to be held responsible for murdering the king of Israel. And he's just sitting there going, oh no, that wasn't how I thought this would go. He's executed for murder. And David still does not take up that authority and mantle of the crown, a testimony to his character. But once again, he wasn't a perfect man, but this was a good choice. So, these are the startings of what ultimately are laying the framework for when David ends up taking power in Israel. And I say taking very ironically because for all intents and purposes it was just a sad and bizarre series of circumstances in which the poor integrity of other people ended up just leaving him as the one who would have no other choice but to take that authority. And this was in a sense God's way of opening a door, not to say that he encouraged what was about to happen here, but it was always going to be God's purpose and plan for David to be on the throne of Israel and to fulfill a very important purpose, which we'll get to in a moment. But as David's rise to power begins, he had an interesting group of people around him, especially a very interesting group of relatives. You remember his older brothers were all soldiers in the Israeli army and very impressive individuals as well. Well, one of his nephews, or some would even account based on the family records that are given to us, one of his cousins, whose name was Joab, he was through and through a soldier. He was the Green Beret. He was the Navy SEAL. He was the guy who would be leading from the front, not the rear. He was a soldier. But he didn't always know when that lifestyle was to stop. He and Abner, who was currently the official leader of Israel, not the figurehead, the political image, as far as Israel's Twitter page, who would be cited as the king, it would be Ishbosheth bin Saul. That would be the idea. Bin meaning son. But Abner would be the one in charge, and he decided, why don't we get together with David's boys, make sure that we're all on good terms. So they decide, as boys do, to just get into a little sparring match. Just make sure, hey, we're on good terms here. But as always, these situations tend to go. Some guy ended up taking a sucker punch, and then based on the insult and height of emotions, he picked up a rock and seriously hurt someone. And then a sword got drawn, and it turned into an outright battle. It was not what was supposed to happen, but what ended up happening. So Joab and all of his posse are going through Abner's boys like no one's business, and Abner's like, this was not my idea. I'm getting out of here. So while he's running, Joab's younger brother decides to go chasing after him. And while Abner's lugging along in his big suit of armor, Joab's brother is not only on lighter feet, but he's even described as being the Hussein Bolt of Israel in his day. So he's catching up to him pretty fast. And Abner's warning this kid. He's saying, I don't want to hurt you. I don't want anything to do with this fight. Kid, stop it. Stop it. I don't want to hurt you. And then finally, he decides the only way I can get this kid to stop is by producing some force here. So what he does is he takes his spear, and obviously the business end is on one part, this point. Then you got the stick. Well, he takes his spear and he lodges the point into the ground, leaving the stick in at an angle. So when, Well, let me get the better angle at this here. So we got the stick pointing up here, and we got Joab's little brother. He'll probably push his diaphragm, get the wind knocked out of him, but hopefully not get killed. Well, Abner launches the spear in with the best of intentions and keeps running, and underestimated how fast Joab's little brother was running, because he ended up running into that stick, that bare stick, so fast and so hard that he ended up impaling himself through the stomach. Not an easy death. And Joab finds his little brother's body, notices the name on the spear, and he says, I got a score to settle. So that starts to happen. Now, totally an accident, but Joab's not going to take it that way. So when Abner lets Ishbosheth know, hey, we had this tussle and it ended up going really bad, I think David's guys are going to be coming after us. So Ishbosheth and Abner, they both personally visit David, and they're like, hey, we're on good terms, right? We want to make sure everything's cool with us. And David's like, oh yeah, dude, you're my literal brother-in-law. I'm married to one of your sisters. We're fine. We're fine. There's no big deal here. Then Abner comes in and he's like, hey, David, I know we had those disagreements in the past, with Saul trying to hunt you down and murdering you and all, but I was just doing my job, and I'm still just trying to do it. We're cool, right? I know that horrible thing happened with your cousin, but we're okay, right? And David's like, yeah, it's sad what happened, but I heard the whole story. It's okay. You were just defending yourself, and it was an accident. So they both go on their way. Then Joab comes in the room, and he's like, hey, David, what have you been doing today? And he said, I just finished a meeting with Ishbosheth and Abner. Abner, you let that guy come in here. You know that he's just trying to spy on us. He's trying to manipulate you, David. You knew that. You knew. I told you. I'm leaving. And David's just like, what? What did I do? So Joab says, hey, Abner. And he finds him before he finds a cab and gets his way out of the city. They didn't have cabs, follow the analogy. Before he leaves town, and he's like, hey, David had one more thing he wanted me to tell you. Why don't you come here into this back alley? You see where this is going. Stab. He literally shivved him in a back alley and then left him to die. Not exactly something that David should respond kindly to. Just like we saw with Saul's murderer, what do you think he should be doing for his cousin? You've committed murder. Here's what God's law says. Here is what's going to be done. Well, unfortunately, he did not make that choice. In whatever his motives were, as far as his cousin is concerned, probably family sympathy if I were to speculate, but take that how you will. He decides just to curse him in the name of God. And it was a pretty hefty curse, mind you. He said, may every single person in your family always have a discharge, always have some sort of weeping disease. May not a single one of you or your kids ever be welcome in the house of God, is what he's saying. I cast you out. And of course, this also involved him getting demoted from the position of general, so he took that kind of hard. But he wasn't executed, and he should have been. And we're going to see why that is in a couple moments here. Because while this is happening, David's kind of sorting up the pieces, getting Abner a proper funeral, and it's all a giant mess. Meanwhile, Ishbosheth finds out that the man behind the throne is dead, and he's left there, pardon my French, but essentially ballless. He has nothing ultimately giving him substance behind the throne. So when, again, I apologize, I'm just being honest here. When Ishbosheth's trying to consolidate power, everyone's looking at him and seeing how he handles business and saying, I think David's the better option here. Now, in every nation, there's going to be people who, A, are misinterpreting signs, B, misinterpret character, and C, just quite frankly shouldn't be involved in politics in any way whatsoever. And we find two such individuals whose names aren't worth mentioning. You can read them on your own time. But they decide, well, David should be the king. This guy currently is the king. I know we can help him out by murdering Ishbosheth, bringing him his head, and that way he'll reward us, because that worked the last time. They decide to do this. They literally come to the guy's house in the middle of the day. They say, "Hey, the maid comes by. It's like, what are you guys doing here? Oh, we're just going on a long walk. You mind if we sit on the patio or something?" They're like, "Oh, sure, that's fine." They sneak into the house while the guy's having a midday siesta, cut his head off in his sleep, and then literally are roaming the prairie side carrying Ishbosheth's head, giggling like schoolgirls. And then they put Ishbosheth's head in front of David and say, "Hey, we took care of your enemy. Now you can fulfill God's purpose for your life." And David's like, "Dude, no. What the actual heck? Executioner, we have two people here who are committing high treason against the true and living God. You remember that 'you shall not murder' thing? And you know how that kind of counts for extra serious if you're murdering the king of Israel? Well, I guess as the new king of Israel, you're both sentenced to death." And they're like, well, they're basically the same as the Amalekite. "That's not what I had in mind. That's the way this was going to go." So David now becomes king, but it wasn't because he was underhanded. It was because other people took matters into his own hands, and God worked it out for good. So, essentially, this is how this crown ended up on David's head. God worked a very bad series of circumstances out for his greater purposes, and we see that that theme is consistent in our lives as well, for better or for worse, in Philippians chapter 1. Now, this is where we start getting into David kind of showing that he wasn't setting out assassins. He makes sure not to do things the way that most Middle Eastern kings would. For those of you who are old enough to remember Saddam Hussein's reign, when he was taking over his authority in the Middle East, basically, when he took power, like all Middle Eastern kings before him, he made sure to murder the entire families of anyone who would possibly pose a threat to his throne by throwing them into a wood chipper. And the accounts actually note the ones that went in head first were lucky. They died quickly because most went in feet first. Not very pleasant individuals. Now, not to say that David had a wood chipper for his enemies, let alone Joab, but I'm sure he would have enjoyed that, but that's an aside. David makes sure to break all the rules, and he says, instead of being the one who's so paranoid in securing my own power and throne, I'm going to demonstrate the heart of God in how I secure my throne. So I'm going to go to all my enemies, all of the remaining threats to my throne. I'm going to find the last surviving member of Saul's family, whose name was Mephibosheth. He was the son of Jonathan, in fact, David's bestie better than the restie, to use a Ruby term. Those of you who know that reference, you'll catch it, and if not, just best friend. Anyway, Mephibosheth, not exactly the person in the best of shape. He was crippled from an accident that occurred during his birth. He essentially was born into a family that wanted to murder the now current king of Israel, and for all intents and purposes was expecting to be killed. But when David invited him into his throne, instead of being met with an axe head, he was met with a hug. And he said, "I want to adopt you as a member of my family. You are going to be welcome in my household for the rest of your life. You're going to be given the basically what would be the most comparable consideration to a wheelchair and care. We're going to make sure that you're going to be taken care of. My own servants, my own people are going to take care of you, and you're going to be in my household, and your kids will be taken care of by mine as well. You are now officially my child." And Mephibosheth's just sitting there going, "Thank you." All he had to do was accept that gift, and an excellent parallel to the heart of God, because when you and I are born into a world where we are given a base nature that is in total rejection and rebellion against God, the moment God shows up, we are committing literally by nature high treason against him. What are we expecting except for death? And yet God instead came to this world and says, based on the sacrifice made on my own son's blood, I want to ask you to be my adopted child. I would like you to be welcomed into my family, and all we have to do is accept it, just like Mephibosheth. Now, also note that just like in this world, those who have been given this offer of mercy, this demonstration and example of God's heart, Mephibosheth was the one who accepted it. There was another who was given the offer to receive this great gift, but unfortunately made the choice that most do in not trusting the one who made the offer. You see, if you remember Nahash, the Syrian king, who attacked the northern borders of Israel and was the first enemy that Saul routed when he established his authority as king, when he was first anointed as king and honoring God in that way. Well, the unfortunate thing is Nahash obviously not the most pleasant of individuals. He said, I'm going to conquer you guys. They said, can we make peace? And he says, sure, we'll make peace if you rip out your eyeballs and cut off all of your thumbs. We have a week to think about it. He was that kind of guy. And so when Nahash died, his son ended up taking power. And David heard about it and said, possible enemy? Hey, guys, and gathered a group of his messengers, and he said, go to that guy. Give him the same offer I made to Mephibosheth. I want to adopt him as one of my children in my family. I want to make the Syrians, our former enemies, welcome in our household forever. Because this is the heart of God. He doesn't want to punish sinners. He wants to save them. So let's go and let's do this. And they're like, all right. So they go to this kid who's just taken the throne, and he says, hey, your dad Nahash, I know he was a guy. And David here has an offer for you. And so he reads the offer, and he's like, you know, there's a rule in law school. If something seems too good to be true, it's probably because it is. I think you guys are just trying to assassinate me. Guards! And so they, restrained them all and said, cut off the lower portions of their garments. So basically pants them and then burn the pants. So they'd be walking around in their tidy whities, except they didn't have those. So take the picture. And then likewise, the mark of an elder, the mark of respect in the Middle East for Israel in the 10th century BC was their beards. He said, shave half of it. Shave half of it. So you'd have to personally shave the other half or just look like a moron until this part would be disproportionate and all that kind of deal. So it would be to utterly humiliate these guys and then kick them out and send them back to David. Well, when they headed back to David, obviously they couldn't enter Israel in broad daylight, so they were kind of waiting by Jericho, hiding like in the bushes and stuff. It's like, David over here. It's like, hey, what's up? Oh my gosh, what happened to you? Says, yeah, he didn't accept your offer. So understand the parallel here. Offer made to someone who didn't deserve it, born in a state where he was essentially dead, and yet because of David's heart, wanting to be like God's, he made him the same offer God made all of us. I want to adopt you as my child. I want to welcome you into my family forever. Mephibosheth accepted it, and therefore received the blessing. Nahash's son, however, did not. So let's catch the parallel. He who has the son has life, John chapter 3, right? He who does not have the son does not have life, but the wrath of God abides on him. I think there's no better way of saying this than just the flat-out, most direct way of putting it. David turned to Joab and said, take care of these guys. No better example and illustration of the wrath of God than I've ever read. So, yeah, they get utterly destroyed. And, oh dear. So, I'm sorry. Did I say the Syrians? They are the Ammonites. Let me backtrack that. This is why I have notes. So Nahash was an Ammonite. His son was an Ammonite. And the detachment that Joab was sent along with to wipe these people out, they were the Ammonites. The Syrians would be harassing Israel after the time of Solomon, which was David's son. So let me get those facts straight. I apologize. Glad I could correct that during the video. So now after David has officially consolidated power, and instead of exterminating his competition, he decides to either adopt it or judge it, offering mercy first, and then if they reject mercy, then comes judgment, the same heart that God has. he then starts to get business done. Now, the responsibility of the king of Israel was not only to obey the true king of Israel, but also to secure Israel's borders, to make sure that there was justice being established in the land. And the first thing, of course, that he sees to doing is to finish the orders that Saul refused from God. He goes on to take care of any Amalekites that are still within Israel's borders. Note, there still were others because Saul let a lot escape. But nonetheless, after 400 plus years, they had been given an extra series of second chances, just like the people of Canaan during the time of Joshua. They were driven out of the land of Canaan, and Israel was allowed to live in peace instead of being harassed and running the risk of being murdered in the street, all while shrieking. It wouldn't be Allahu Akbar, but you understand the point being made. The practice hasn't changed. In fact, the Nabatean cultures were the ones who originally worshipped this god Allah, except he had a wife named Malat. So there's some little research that you can do on your own. Now, this is where they start to be looking for a capital. And up till this point, remember, the majority of Israel as we know it today was still under occupation by the Philistines and by the other splinter groups of the Canaanites that weren't successfully driven out yet. The peak of Israel's empire and borders is about to take place when they are going to drive out the final capital of the Jebusites. And the Jebusites were one of the people named as to which would be driven out of the land. Not exterminated, but driven out. Now, their capital, which was called Jerusalem, was an incredibly fortified position. At the peak of this very high elevated position would make attacking it with an army on foot difficult. And likewise, the walls were no slouch either. And they mocked David. They said, hey, our crippled, our weak, our old, they could man the walls and drive all of your armies back. And David, taking this insult personally, as much as he should, said, all right, soldiers, I got a proposition for you. Whichever one of you is able to sneak into that city, find a way to open the gates from the inside. You'll be our special infiltrator, if you will, our spy. If you're able to open those city gates and allow us to invade it, I will promote him to a general. Now, who do you think's going to volunteer for that position? Joab, Mr. Delta Force himself, is like, ooh, I can finally get my position, and David has to give it to me. Great. So what Joab does is he sneaks through the city's well system, and based on the parallel historical accounts we get in First Chronicles, Joab manages to climb up the inner city's well and just go berserk inside the city, taking out people and going on his way, opens the city gates, and as David charges in, he sees his cousin, and he's like, oh, junk, I have to keep my word now. And David at first tried to find a loophole in this. He's like, oh, hey, sorry, I already gave this position to this other guy. And Joab shivved him in a back alley too. So David finally said, and no, should have been executed, didn't. David finally said, fine, you can be a general again. Just stop shivving people. This is no promises. So Joab. Anywho. So he gets his job back, and Israel now has its capital. David establishes the political center of Israel in Jerusalem, and now starts to wonder, or reshuffle his priorities rather, and says, well, now that we've got our political capital, we need to start getting back to our relationship with God. Because during the time of King Saul, the Ark of the Covenant, the tabernacle, it wasn't being put up. It wasn't in use. It was all in storage inside the house of that priest. After the Philistines had brought it back, the priest got a little drunk and decided to look inside of it, and over 100,000 people died. Now, the accuracy of those accounts may be, well, either mistranslated or just be downright too honest, but nonetheless, that's something I'd be more than happy to discuss with you. This is back in 1 Samuel, and we did discuss that when we went through it. But he wants to restore the spiritual capital of Israel, and this says, what better place than here? This is our most defensible position. It can also be our center of commerce in every single way. So he says, we need to bring the tabernacle back. So he gets it all constructed, and he says it's not complete without the place in which God said he would directly manifest his presence with the people of Israel, where the sacrifice would take place during the Day of Atonement, also known as Yom Kippur, where the high priest would offer the blood of the spotless lamb and provide a picture of Jesus Christ into the future, where everything would ultimately be fulfilled as far as that picture God intended, and where he would be meeting with his people. This picture of heaven, this would be his throne. And so they bring the Ark of the Covenant in the way that the Bible prescribed and told them to in the book of Leviticus. Oops, did I say that? I mean, copied the example of the Philistines by putting it on a cart. Not like the Bible told him to. Well, you could imagine this would have consequences, but fortunately they didn't stop, or they did stop before more than a lot of people died. There was a man named Uzzah who saw one of the ox stumble and was worried that the cart would end up going with it. There's multiple oxes. There's no reason for him to consider being worried about this, but they were still disobeying God's law. So he went to steady the Ark of the Covenant by touching it. Also, something that you're specifically told not to do, and the consequences explicitly stated, that in the height of the moment, that should have never happened in the first place, he ignored, and Uzzah ends up being struck dead. And this time of great celebration ends up into a time where they're looking at this guy's dead body, smitten by God, and they're just going, oh, right, we're dealing with God here. I guess this is something we need to take seriously, right? And they all look at David, and he's like, yeah, we should. And so, after basically consolidating a little bit, getting himself some time to swallow his pride, he comes back to the people and says, we're dealing with God here. Okay, we need to make sure that we do this right. So instead of on the cart, they took it off the cart, not didn't touch it, but they made sure they put the gold rods through and had that specific family of Levites carry the Ark of the Covenant, and every time they took a certain number of steps, they then sacrificed an animal as an apology to God. So, definitely followed through on the sincerity of that apology, and a harsh lesson learned. Now, it was then that the Ark of the Covenant was brought into Jerusalem. They celebrated, everyone was dancing and laughing, and David, he didn't dress up in his royal kingly robes. He just put on a linen ephod, and he was jigging it out like everyone else, saying, God's here, this is wonderful. And he didn't make any scene of it. However, Saul's daughter, the queen, Michal, she was looking at David, and being the princess that she was, as well as having some internal politics and relationship exchanges that happened between the time here with Saul and now. I'll summarize it for you because I think it's worth mentioning. Michal was originally supposed to marry David when he slayed Goliath. Saul went back on that deal. Michal was attracted to him. Well, so Saul said, okay, you want to marry my daughter? I know I said if you kill Goliath, but that's not good enough. What you do is you bring me 100 foreskins of the enemies of Israel, the Philistines, and then I'll let you marry my daughter. And he's like, okay, I'm going to need some gloves, I guess. That's kind of weird. And he not only accomplishes it, but brings back a bag of 200 pieces of skin from the Philistines' junk and hands it to his now father-in-law and says, Happy Valentine's Day, sicko. And so he gets to marry his daughter. Now, Michal obviously kind of weirded out by this, but happy to be married to the girl that she's been crushing over and seeing just really being used by God in these powerful ways. We see that after he has to start running for his life, that she, pulls a Ferris Bueller and, stacks up the pillow so that it looks like David's sleeping so that he can escape, and the assassins waiting outside checking on him can just basically buy that ploy. And then when they finally find out that she covered for him, Saul is about to kill his daughter. So she, instead of trusting God to protect her, says, oh, he threatened to kill me if I didn't let him go, which wasn't true. So Saul said, oh, I knew that, David. I'm going to make sure that you marry a real man. And so she married her off to another guy. Now, obviously, a low blow on Saul's part, not the first that he made in his life. And while Michal was married to this guy for better half of a decade, she was happy with him. And then finally, when David ended up taking the throne of Israel, he had a few requests. And not only can I have my wife back, oh, she's married to this other guy. Really? Divorce. You're coming home with me. Well, you could imagine Michal had some feelings about that. Not only was the guy heartbroken, who was sincerely a good husband, but now she's seeing her husband prancing around, not acting like the king that he's supposed to be, and she being growing up as the princess, thinks this is uncouth, already harboring bitterness towards the guy, and says, oh, well, weren't you so special, looking out there all unclothed and like the common folk? You weren't wearing your special robes. You weren't wearing your crown. You look fancy. Worshipping God. You look like a total loser. And David, taking this personally, he says, I'll continue to look like a loser, and you'll continue never to have kids. So, now again, whether this was supernaturally closing her womb on God's part, or David just no longer engaging in that with her so that she would never have kids, I think it's more likely the latter, because obviously David has, well, again, not exactly a model citizen when it comes to sexual morality, but nonetheless, I think it's not that difficult to practice self-control when you have a woman in your house with that kind of attitude. Nonetheless, it was at this time that, passing all over the stuff with Michal, David starts looking at the tabernacle, and he sees the Ark of the Covenant, the very presence of God being manifested, and he sees it in a tent. Nice tent, one sewn by Moses, definitely something with great significance, as it was modeled directly after the throne of God. But then he looks at his house, and he's seeing all the gold and the stone and that security when it's raining and the elements, and he's just like, this isn't right. This isn't right. I'm living in a palace. God, you've given me this house, and you're living in a tent. God, I want to build you a house. And so Nathan, the one recording all this history, comes to him and says, hey, David, how are you doing today? You wanted something? And David says, yeah, I've been praying about this. I just wanted to know what you think. I want to build a temple for God, like a legitimate house, a place of worship, spared no expense. We're going all Jurassic Park up in this. And Nathan, without praying about it himself, he's just like, that's a fantastic idea. Do all that's in your heart, David. And then he goes home, and God comes to Nathan, and he says, Nathan, I didn't tell you to say that. David is a man of war. His hands have blood on them. It would be too ironic for a bloody soldier's hands to be building the house of God to bring peace to all the earth. That would be wrong message, right? So here's what I want you to say to him. I love his heart. I love him. Tell him that you won't build me a house. I will build you a house. And he comes to him and he tells him this. I'm going to build you a house. You and your family will always sit on the throne of Israel. Your house, your family, will be the one in which I will directly enter this world through. You will be the spiritual inheritor of God's promises to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, to Judah, to David. And this would be the chief qualification in 2 Samuel that would ultimately qualify the Messiah, is he had to be from the royal lineage of David, because God put it in writing. You are going to be my biological family. Wow. So, noting that point as something significant going forward, that would basically be David's peak. The greatest thing that he would ever contribute to this world is him being marked out as the king in which the Messiah would come to this world through. However, he was still human. And that's when we start to get into the other half of this historical account, in which the honest record of his life would include the good, the bad, and the ugly. And of course, I'm sure you know the most significant and famous of which was his interaction with Bathsheba. It was the time in which he should have been in battle. but he wasn't. He was staying at home. He was taking a lot of naps, and as you all know, when you sleep in, you can't get to sleep as well the next night, so you're pacing and stuff. He's taking advantage of the opportunity to, turn off his alarm clock rather than snooze it. And so he goes out in the middle of the night to the pinnacle of the city where his castle is, where his palace is, right? And he's overlooking the city, and dead of night, right? He sees a very, very attractive woman bathing on a roof. Now, note this isn't uncommon, nor was this immodest on her part. In that day, your roof was essentially your backyard, and not only did you have walls that would set some measure of security for that, but was also important is the city was pretty leveled out, with the exception of the king's house. So when the king was overlooking this, he would be the only one given that vantage point. And likewise, Bathsheba chose to bathe at this time of night so that not a lot of people would be looking. From the evidence that we have no reason to think she was being immodest or deliberately trying to manipulate David in this regard. However, just like with the things that we see in our world today, the internet oftentimes makes it too easy. We oftentimes can't help when we see those suggestive images. However, those suggestions towards arousal are the times where we can make a choice, either to look away or to get out the binoculars, to focus. And that's what David chose to do. He chose to let a lustful image impose lust upon him. And this lust turns to desire, this desire turned to action, and because of his relationship with God having taken an ebb at this time, he acted against his better judgment. He asked, "Who is that woman?" And one of his servants is like, "Oh, that house, that's the wife of your most trusted soldier, Uriah the Hittite, a non-Jewish person who had come to a saving relationship with God because of David." Yeah, that guy that you led to Jesus, the guy, his wife, you sure you should be looking at that? And David says, "Go to her house, bring her to me." And so he does. And we don't know Bathsheba's motives on this part, whether he pulled a Bill Clinton and used authority imposed on her or just charmed her. We don't know. All we know is that she comes back the next day after their steamy fling and pointing at the pregnancy test meme, right? 9 months, you're going to have a boy. Well, David, wanting to cover himself, decides not to bring this matter to Nathan and ultimately to God and admit what he had done was wrong while he still could, but made matters worse in making that classic excuse we all make when we make mistakes, is I may as well keep going, I've gone this far. Not recommended. Speaking from experience here. Not in, of course, adultery and / murder, but nonetheless. He invites Uriah back from the battlefield that he should be in. He asks, "Hey man, how you doing?" He's looking at this guy. He's sleeping with his wife. He is trying to pull one over on this guy. Just total scumbag move. And he says, "Hey, just wanted to reward you for your excellent service. Why don't you go home tonight? You crazy kids, go hang out with your wife. You guys, you haven't seen each other in a long time. A lot of catching up to do. You know what I mean? Nudge, nudge." And Uriah is like, "No, I can't do that. My soldiers are out sleeping in the dirt and fearing for their lives. They're trusting the guy on watch so that they don't get stabbed in the middle of the night. You think I'm going to go home to my wife while they're all doing that?" And so he stays in, it says David's porch, but that's not like he slept out front on the concrete where his driveway was. It was literally the guest room, basically. And so David's like, "Oh, this isn't working. He's not going to realize that baby is not mine if he doesn't do the deed. I know, I'll get him drunk." So the next day he gets this big feast. He gets Uriah hammered, and yet even then Uriah refuses to go home to his wife. And we see that drunk Uriah is more honorable than David currently was sober. And so David decides, I have no other choice. So he writes a letter basically to the newly crowned General Joab, recrowned rather, and says, "Send Uriah the Hittite as well as several others," because obviously you can't just send one guy on a mission without him being suspicious. except for Joab, but he's the exception, not the rule. And he says, just send him on a suicide mission. Rolls it up, seals it, and says, hand this to the general, general's eyes only. And Uriah, with a smile, takes it, fully trusting his best friend, and goes. He ends up dying. Bathsheba mourns for her husband, sincerely. She isn't in on all of this. And David mourns with her and offers, oh, nation, this woman who's given up the greatest of sacrifices, lost her husband in service to this country. I want to demonstrate the heart of God to you, just like I did with Mephibosheth and just like what I tried to do with Nahash's son. I want to invite you into my home. I'm going to make you one of my wives. Now, hey, first strike, you're not supposed to do that. One wife. Secondly, oh geez, really scumbag move in trying to gain political points and all this. And then finally, 3, or even if he can fool all the people some of the time, as I believe it was Abraham Lincoln who said this, you can fool all the people some of the time and some of the people some of the time, but you can't fool all the people all the time. Well, God wasn't fooled by this. And for 1 whole year, while David is living at large, attending tabernacle, synagogue, all that kind of stuff, just putting on this holy Joe face, this ebb of conscience, he wrote a psalm about it, was just draining his soul from the inside. He just felt like he was dead. And it was this kind of conviction that showed that he still had a relationship with God, even when he sinned. And it was finally when Nathan was told by God what David had done, so he could call him out on it. Doesn't go up, point a finger, and say, David, you're a jerk. Let me tell you what I mean. He goes to him and he says, hey, you're a king, settling out legal disputes. Think you can solve this matter? Sure, happily. And so he tells him a story about a guy who was supposed to provide a meal for his guest, common courtesy in those days. And he had a huge flock. And his neighbor, he only had 1 lamb. He was going to use it for meat, but decided to keep it as a pet. He treated it like one of his daughters. His kids loved it. His wife loved it. They wouldn't touch this lamb. It was like a member of the family. Well, instead of going to one of his flocks, he decided to take his neighbor's flock, or his neighbor's sheep, not a flock. He decided to take his neighbor's sheep and feed him with that. And so, not only would he be charged for robbery, he'd have to restore 4-fold according to the law, but that was just a jacked up thing to do. So, David, being the shepherd boy that he was, not only takes this personally, but also with the kind of clarity towards sin that only a guilty conscience can provide, he says, that man ought to be put to death. And Nathan points at him and says, David, you're that man. And David admits it. He confesses his sin. He says the same thing about it. That's what that word means. To confess is to say the same thing. He looked at what he had done and saw it with God's eyes finally and says, I have sinned. And before he starts walking off to lob his own head off, Nathan says, and God has forgiven you. However, because we're still under this covenant, he didn't say that, but that's the circumstances, there's going to be consequences for your actions in this life. First off, understand the child that will result from this pregnancy, God is going to take home. He will be in the hands of the true and living God. He will not enter this life, but will be entering eternal life. And this would be actually one of the set passages we would know that, say you had a miscarriage, or if a child is aborted, where do they go? Well, understand, not only biologically are they as much a life as you and me, but God has a purpose and a plan. God has given that child life, and they are safe in his arms. Now, as far as the topic of the age of accountability, I would personally advise and understand that's a more personal issue. Whether that person is capable of knowing, it varies. Some people would say it's a set date. If you come to the Lord before 20, then you're set, but anytime after that, you're personally responsible. Some would say 13, some would say 9. Others, it just basically depends. I would personally believe that God is going to not only do what is right, but also know when that person is capable of making a choice with the evidence that they have. Many, like with learning disabilities perhaps. God's going to greatly extend that measure of grace. He has that kind of character. But this child would ultimately end up dying. He would go to heaven. And David would ultimately bear the guilt for that, along with Bathsheba, and they did. But he also said something else different. He said that violence, the sword, would not depart from your household. And what that meant was given to us and explained right away. David had multiple wives, and this was one thing that he was not supposed to do, one of many things he was not supposed to do, because not only did God create marriage under the definition that a man will leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, singular, and the two shall become one flesh. Every single time we see polygamy demonstrated in the Bible, it is never glowingly. It only causes further troubles. Now note, God can use our mess to make a better picture, but understand it's still a mess and not God's best. So when we're talking about David committing polygamy, this is not something the Bible looked on positively. And as we can see here, made for a very broken family structure. So the oldest son of David, whose name was Amnon, was growing up living at large in the king's house. And after hearing about dad's scandal, chuckling a little bit, they all move on with their lives. But then, remembering that birds and the bees talk and acknowledging his own urges, decides to direct his attention and noting, my sister is actually really attractive. Now understand, this is just as creepy as it sounds. Amnon is a total D-bag. But when we're talking about the reality of the situation, the girl that Amnon had his eyes for, her name was Tamar, was the daughter of one of David's other wives, so he could kind of justify it in his own mind. It wasn't, but nonetheless. So he's having the feelies for her, and he doesn't know what to do with his emotions. So instead of going to his dad, who's obviously a great example of sexual morality and self-control, he decides to turn to the priest Nathan and find godly counsel. He turns to his loser friends who are just using him for his money. Or rather his dad's money. And giving him the modern advice on the topic. If you have a feeling, then go for it. Well, Amnon, based on their advice, and they helped him come up with this idea, decides to pretend that he's sick, and he asks, hey, Tamar, can you make me some bread? Convinces her to come in the room alone with them, takes advantage of, and rapes her. Now, this not only destroys her life, but it also shows Amnon's true colors as the absolute loser that he actually was, because the moment that he engaged in this, he realized exactly how he was viewing her and then started treating her like it. She was just a piece of meat that I was wanting to use to feel good. It would be like C.S. Lewis uses in the illustration. He had smoked the cigarette, so he didn't keep the pack as a treasure and saying, this is the thing that has given me so much pleasure. It was just an object to him. So he throws Tamar out, and her life is completely devastated. And her older brother, Absalom, who was David's second oldest son, looks at Amnon, looks at David, and is waiting for the hammer to fall. He raped your daughter. I don't care if he's your oldest son. Justice here, man. And we see that David's compromises with Joab and his family are starting to show in deeper roots and problems here. So Amnon sees David doing nothing, so he says, well, I'm going to take matters in my own hands. Hey, Amnon, want to go hunting? Sure. Oops. And he murders his brother. And what does David do? Nothing. And that gives not Amnon, he's dead, Absalom the time to look then at his father and say, Tamar was all your fault. This is all your fault. And so during this time, he decides to start working undercover, involving himself in the lives of the people of Israel, and start to win friendships and gain influence and become the popular figurehead, all for the purpose of overthrowing and killing his father in revenge for his sister. And so finally, when he decides to cash in these chips after a few years of stewing this pot of bitterness, he declares himself as the next king of Israel. And David, instead of fighting, he says, no, we're not shedding any blood in this city. God's here. We're not doing that. I will voluntarily leave, and you can take the throne. And so David and all those that support him go on his way. All those that didn't support David are celebrating, cussing him out, throwing rocks. They obviously wouldn't have Twitter feeds to mock him, so they just came to him in person and did that. And David took it. He knew this was all his fault. So he goes to the same place that he was hiding out from Saul in, those caves, the young goats, this mountain, the hills, the young goats, valleys, mountains, whichever topographical feature you would prefer. But nonetheless, Absalom's ready. He's gathered the throne. He's surrounded himself with all of David's old men. And one of them, one in particular, who was the smartest of guys in Israel in his day, they said, listen to this guy, you were listening to the wisdom of God. His name, and careful attention to this, Ahithophel, was the father of Bathsheba, father-in-law to Uriah. Do you think he held good feelings towards David? Absolutely not. So he'd be using his noodle to boil David's bowl here. And essentially, I know that analogy falls apart, but you catch the point. He's not happy about it. So he's telling Absalom, here's what you do. Here's how you kill David. More than happy to help here. Wait. Gather the support of all the tribes of Israel, not just Judah. Because note, we're still getting used to this power exchange, right? All the textbooks are going to need to be changed. The flag's going to be changed. All these other different things. So here's what you do. You gain the favor of all of the armies of Israel, not just Judah. So that way, remember, he may be a loser, but he's a skilled soldier. He's got more experience than you can imagine in that department. But if you have more soldiers than anyone would be able to handle, you will defeat him. So wait, and then you will be given victory. However, another one of his supporters was still friends with David. And let me see in my notes here. Keeping track of these names is difficult. Hushai. He was the one who gave him the advice that would appeal to his ego and that he knew would work in David's favor. And of course, building up to his ego, he's like, no, man, Absalom, you are the real soldier here. You got youth on your side. You got the hair on your side. You got everything on your side. You got the best armies that Israel will ever have to offer. And you're going to be the one to take your old man out. Note, God is on your side. You're the one who's the champion of justice. You're Batman. It doesn't matter if Superman can do it. You can beat him. And Absalom's like, yeah, I am Batman. I'm the knight, you know? And so he's getting all pumped up. And Ahithophel's like, no, you idiot. You're going to be outnumbered. And he's still listening to Hushai. And he's like, no, I like his better. It's like, you young imbecile. And so he heads out of the city and he decides to kill himself because he knows where this is headed. Hushai sends word ahead to David that Absalom's coming and exactly what to expect, from where, with whom, everything is set in order. And so David sends Joab and one of his other generals to ambush Absalom as he himself is waiting. He's heading to attack him, and they are absolutely slaughtered. Now, Absalom manages to escape on his donkey. However, a characteristic thing, for those of you guys who don't know, the idea of guys having long hair was an exclusive custom to royalty. The only time that guys would have long hair in Israel was for either they had taken the Nazirite vow, dedicated themselves to God, they wouldn't shave or cut their hair till after the vow was complete, or if you were a prince, in which you'd let your hair grow out for 1 full year, and then you'd cut it off and sell it as a resale item, and those would be your taxes. So the resale value, Absalom's hair, they said he had such a thick and dark head of hair, this big black mane, and he looked like he was from Dragon Ball. It would literally weigh in a matter of pounds if you were to carry it. It was just, if you were to harry it, I say that with no sense of correcting. He was just that kind of bushel going on there. So he's running with his mane, and he's got his donkey going, and the donkey's obviously running for his life. He doesn't want to get killed either. And Absalom's, just like trying to keep his wits about him. And then this huge brush, this giant tree branch with all these tangled thorns and stuff, ends up slamming Absalom in the face that the donkey dives under, but Absalom obviously can't. He gets knocked out, and all of his hair ends up getting tangled, and he's just hanging from the tree by his flowy locks. And so one of the soldiers is trying to hunt down the stragglers, and he sees Absalom, and he's like, "King's orders, don't touch my son, I'll deal with him." Okay, so where is he? Okay, I'll report back to the general. "Joab," you can see where this is going. "I found Absalom. Let's inform David." Joab's like, "David? Pansy's probably going to spare his life. Why didn't you kill him? I would have paid you a bonus if you had done that." And he's like, "I'm not disobeying God or the king. I don't care what you're going to pay me." He says, "Give me your spear." So he grabs him and a couple other of his friends, and he takes the spears, and 1, 2, 3, 4. Totally overkill, right? He impales this poor kid in the tree way too many times. But definitely to service the point, Joab takes Absalom out. And so David, when he hears about his next oldest son getting murdered, oh boy, that breaks his heart. And oh my goodness, another testament to his character, that he still loves this kid after all that he's put him through, just like with Saul. But here's the problem. All of those soldiers in his army who had been risking their lives, being willing to die, and they find out that their enemy has finally been destroyed, the cause of all of it, and their king is crying about it. Joab gets in David's face and does the one good thing that he actually does in this book. He says, "David, listen, those men were willing to die for you, and you are acting like you would have preferred they all died and Absalom lived. If you don't get out there and give your soldiers some support, then you are going to be in a worse position than you ever were with Absalom. You will be alone against the armies of Israel." And so David's like, okay. And so he goes out. It's like, yeah, we did it. But he's still brokenhearted. And he knows that this is all his fault. So, understanding this as well, David finally comes to the end of his life. He makes another series of mistakes along the way. No one's perfect. Israel, especially kings, were told not to take censuses, a record of the people, unless they were directly commanded by God. David did it for not those reasons, and he ended up bringing a plague on the people of Israel. David, of course, when he recognized this, learned from the last time he blew it, took full responsibility first, and went directly to God. And God said, "Plagues happen. What do you want to happen? Do you want to be on the run for your life again? Be handed over to your enemies for a few years? Do you want famine in the land, or do you want a plague for a few days?" So, years of life on the run, months of plague and famine where the whole of Israel is affected, or just deal with me directly for a few days. And David's like, I'd rather deal with you and your merciful heart than anyone else. Excuse me. I'll take the third option there. I'd rather deal with you directly. And so as the plague's happening and people are dying, God already is saying, all right, here's how you receive mercy, David. Go up to the peak of the city. Build an altar there, and that is where the temple is one day going to be built by your son. And so David does that, and he's offered it for free, but he says, oh no, I'm not going to give something to God I got for free. I invest in my relationships, and I certainly want to show how much I value God in this. So he buys the place where ultimately the temple would one day be built, and the plague stops. Then, reaching the end of his life, in 2 Samuel chapter 22, we are given a recounting of Psalm 18, where essentially he just goes over his life and says, God was always the source of my strength. Anything I did right, I was doing after him. Anything I did wrong, it wasn't because of him, it was because of me. God, you are my rock. You are my deliverer. You are my fortress. You are my strength. You are the source of every good and perfect blessing. You are everything. You are the one who dealt with my enemies. You are the one who gave me friends. You were ultimately the only one worth talking about when it came to the end and ultimate summation of my life. And that was David's heart. And the book ends passing over into 1 Kings. We'll do more of this when we get to the book, where he gets his affairs in order in setting up Solomon, the next son that he had through Bathsheba, as his successor, and that is confirmed. And then finally, to just finish up this whole book, understand what made David, what he was often called, a man after God's own heart. It wasn't because he was perfect. His life story tells us that. But because his relationship with God was his greatest priority. Understand the same is true with you and with me and our Creator. His relationship with you is his greatest priority. And if we want to share his heart, then we should do the same. Thank you for your time and listening to this study. If you have any sincere questions, ask them. If you'd like to encourage the ministry, please do so. But most importantly, if you know someone who isn't as familiar with 2 Samuel as they should be, please share this study with anyone you feel would be blessed and benefit from it. Thank you for your time. Remember that Jesus loves you. I say that in sincerity. And also know that his greatest priority isn't judging sinners. It's in establishing relationships. We have a fine example in the life of King David to see that in action.